and welcome back. In this episode, we're going to be adding some river tiles to the tiny terrain, so the kind of thing that you can see on the screen here. And, as always, you can find a link to the PDF file for these down in the description. Okay, for the hex tiles themselves, it's the same process as before. So we'll simply stick the printout to some foam core or similar, and then we'll cut it to size. It's as simple as that. And all we'll need to do then is glue on some houses, trees, or whatever, just like we did with the regular tiles. However, I have filled the edges of the pages with a few other bits and pieces that can be used alongside these rivers and streams, so for the rest of the video I'll be showing how to make those, starting with a little bridge. Right then, we'll first need to glue these two shapes to some foam core, and when they're dry, we'll cut those out. There you go. And all we're going to do with these is glue them back to back, so that they form the basic shape of the bridge itself. Essentially, this kind of thing. Okay, next we're going to take this texture, and glue that to some thin card. But before we cut it out, we're first going to score it along these lines. So, that's what you can see me doing here. Then we'll need to measure the combined thickness of our foam core pieces, as we're going to be cutting the cobblestone pattern to the same width. So I'll go ahead and do that first, and then cut the rest to size. There you go. Then, when we bend it along the scored lines, that should fit nicely on top of the foam core piece, as you can see. So I'll just quickly glue that into place, using the trusty glue stick, so that we end up with something that looks like this. Okay then, next we'll need to glue the sides of the bridge to a piece of really thick cardboard, and if you're wondering what I've used for this, it's just the back of one of those card-backed envelopes. Anyway, as I say, we'll glue the sides of the bridge to one side, but we'll also glue some of the plain stone pattern to the other side, so that, when we cut it out, we end up with a piece that's textured on both sides. And while you could leave it like that, if you don't like the exposed edge, we can cut out a thin strip of the stone texture that's the same thickness as the card, and glue that around the outside, which is exactly what I'm doing here. So, there you go, something like that. And we will of course need to do that for both sides. Now, all that's left to do is stick everything together. And to do this, I'm going to apply some glue to the sides of the foam core piece, and then glue the sides into place so that they're overhanging each end by a similar amount, and also making sure that the whole thing sits nice and flat. And there you go, there's the finished bridge. And the only thing left to do now is take the hex tile with the road that's kind of bisected by the river, and glue our little bridge on top. So there you go, that's that done. Another thing we can make are some docks. And for these, we'll first take this texture and glue that to some thin card. Then, when it's dry, we can cut that into thin strips. In this example, I've gone with 1/4 of an inch wide. And if I just bring one of the hex tiles back in, you can see how I've cut that strip into various different lengths, so that I can get a kind of dock layout that I'm happy with. And while you could glue them down like that, I'm going to raise mine up a bit. And to do this, I'm going to cut out a thin strip of the same card, and from that we can cut two lengths that are a bit shorter than our wooden planks. Then all we're going to do is glue one of these to the back of the wooden deck, and then glue the other piece on top of the first one, so that we end up with this kind of thing. And we'll need to do that for all of our pieces. Now, for mine, I'm also going to make a couple of steps, and to make these, we'll simply need to cut one piece of the deck texture that's 3 planks wide, and another that's 2 planks wide, and glue them one on top of the other, which is all I'm doing here. And it's a bit hard to see, but this is the kind of thing that we're aiming for. Anyway, now it's time to glue it all together. So I'll start by gluing the steps to the underside of the decking, so something like that. Hopefully you can see what I've done there. And if I bring in the hex tile again, we can then start gluing those into place. So there's the first piece going on, and I'll do the same for the other 2 pieces. And if it all goes to plan, it should end up looking something like this. Now, you could call that done, But I'm going to take it a step further. So next we'll need to cut out a strip of the plain wooden texture that's roughly 3/4 of an inch by 1.5 inches, and we're going to roll this up into a tiny little tube. And to help get it started, I like to take a toothpick and start wrapping the paper around that. Then I can remove the toothpick and attempt to roll the paper up as tightly as possible. Then we can apply some glue to the end of the paper, like so, and then roll it back up again, so that it kinda looks a bit like a wooden pole, as you can see here. And to speed things up a bit, here's one that's had plenty of time to dry. Okay, the next thing we'll need to do is see how far the deck is sitting above the water, as we're going to be cutting the pole a little bit longer than that. So for mine, it looks as though roughly 1/8 of an inch will be enough. So here I am cutting one end of the pole to size. And we will need to make quite a few of those, and we'll be gluing them into place with a bit of PVA. Now, the way I'm going to do this is by dabbing the end of the toothpick into the PVA, and then kind of placing that where I want to glue the post, so that a spot of glue ends up on the top of the tile, as well as on the side of the decking itself. Then, as you can see, I'll place one of the posts on top of the glue, and if it's not quite right, I can move it into position with the other end of the toothpick. So here I am doing the same thing again, and I think it might be a little bit easier to see from this angle. But all we're really doing is aiming for something that looks like that. Anyway, I'll really speed this next part up as I make my way around the entire deck. So there's the last couple being glued into place now, and there you have it. This is how it should look at this stage. Now, if you bought one of those small hole punches for the treasure piles that we made last year, we can use that again here to punch out a few tiny circles. And here's a lot more that I've made off camera. So to finish things off, all we're going to do is put a tiny spot of PVA on the top of each post, and then stick one of these punched out circles on top of that. Obviously, you don't have to do this if you haven't got a suitably sized punch, but since I do have one now, I thought I'd put it to use again. And as you can hopefully see, I'm just using the one end of the toothpick to apply the glue, and the other end to pick up and place the circle. Anyway, when we're done, this is how it should look. Though it's probably not going to be much use without any boats, so that's what we'll have a go at making next. Right then, we're going to be gluing the main boat texture to more of that really thick card, and once they're dry, we'll cut them to size with a sharp pair of scissors. Then we'll cut out a piece of the wooden plank pattern that's roughly 3 inches long, but also 6 planks wide. And we're going to score that along the middle, so that we can bend it in half with 3 planks on either side. So, something like that. Then we can take a piece of thin card, and we're going to glue the wooden planks over the edge of this card so that we have 3 planks of the wood texture upon either side. Just like you can see here. And when that's dry, we can cut that out, and if we're making the large boat, we'll need to cut out all 3 of the planks. If we're making the small boat, we'll only need the 2, but since I'm going to be making the medium-sized boat in this example, I'll be cutting this one 2.5 planks high. Plus, we're also going to score a line along the centre, just so that it's easy to fold the whole thing in half. Like so. Okay then, for this next part, we're going to apply some glue to the inside of the folded piece, but we're going to try to avoid getting any glue on the topmost plank. Then we're going to fold it into a kind of wishbone shape, and what I'm trying to do here is sandwich the main piece of the boat inside this strip, so that the plank that we didn't apply any glue to is positioned above the deck of the boat. It's a bit hard to explain, and it's a bit tricky as well, and you might need to use a toothpick to push part of the deck up or down to get it into a better position, but yeah. What we're aiming for is something that looks like this. However, the glue stick isn't going to give us a great bond, so once everything is in the right place, I'll continue squeezing the sides of the boat together, and while I'm doing this, I'll add a tiny spot of super glue to the inside corner, and hold that in place until it sets. Then we'll just need to do the same thing for the other corner. Okay then, so in addition to that, I also like to squeeze out a bit of superglue onto a piece of scrap card, and then, using a toothpick, I'll run a tiny line of glue between the two side pieces at the front and the back of the boat, just to make sure that they don't come apart when we cut it to size in the next step. And if you like, you can also add a bit of glue around all of the edges on the underside of the boat as well. Anyway, when we're done, we should be left with something like this. So, a medium-sized boat that's 2.5 planks high. And just for comparison, here's the large boat that's 3 planks high. And here's the small boat that's just the 2 planks high. And that's the main part of each boat done. Now, to make them a bit more boat-shaped, we're first going to cut off both ends at a roughly 45-degree angle. There you go. And then we'll cut the top half again, but this time at a much shallower angle, almost vertical. So if I bring in the finished boat, you can see the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So yeah, that's the kind of shape that we're aiming for. Now for the sails, we're going to take these 3 textures and score them along these guidelines. And just like we did with the sides of the boats, we're going to be gluing these over the edge of a thin piece of card. So I'll go ahead and do that now, and in this instance we're trying to make sure that the guideline is positioned along the very edge of the card, so that the texture is kinda mirrored on both sides, if that makes sense. Basically, we're looking to make something like this. Now, when it comes to cutting these out, you'll notice that one side of the texture has a kind of extra bleed area. So, if we cut out the smaller of the 2 sides, we shouldn't run into any problems if both sides aren't exactly 100% aligned. And that's all I've done here. Okay, now the last thing we're going to make is a little mast, and for this we'll cut out a 3/4 inch square of the plain wooden pattern, and we'll do the same thing with this as we did with the posts of the dock. And I'm also going to trim off the top and the bottom just to make sure that they're both nice and neat. Then it's just a matter of applying a tiny spot of superglue to the mast, and then sticking the sail into place, which should result in this kind of thing. Okay then, so to finish things off, we'll just need to glue one of these masts to the middle of our little boat. So there you go, there's a medium-sized boat with the sail down. And here's another one with the sail up. Then there's a large boat with a large sail. And finally, a small boat with no sail at all. So, if I go ahead and add all of these to the little dock area that I made earlier in the episode, we can make something that looks like this. And I think I'm going to glue my boats into place, but if you prefer, you could leave them as separate pieces. Anyway, another thing I've included is a water wheel, and for this we'll need to glue both of these textures to a piece of thick card, and then cut them to size once they've had plenty of time to dry. Then we'll take the glue stick and glue these 2 pieces back to back, so that we end up with a wheel that's textured on both sides. Next we'll take this texture and score it along this line here, so that we can then fold it in half. And this time we'll be gluing this to part of an empty toilet roll tube, so that we can take advantage of its curved shape. So, like before, we'll wrap this over the edge, so that we have half of the texture on either side, and we'll also accentuate the curve a little bit by wrapping it around a pen, so that we end up with this kind of thing, which we can cut to size once it's dry. Then we can apply some glue to the outside of the wheel, and stick the little toilet roll piece around the edge, making sure that it's somewhat centralised. So, something like this. And then we can cut away the excess from either end. Next, we'll take this little wood pattern and glue that around one of those tiny drinking straws. And to speed things up again, here's one where I've trimmed one end to size. Okay, now this is going to be the piece that connects the wheel to the side of one of our tiny houses. So here's the example house that I've made, just using the textures and techniques from the tiny houses episode. And as you can see, because I've decided to glue the wheel to the side with the overhang, I'm going to have to make sure that this piece is long enough to clear the top floor, as well as having a bit of a gap between the wheel and the house itself. So once I'm happy with the size, I'll add a blob of hot glue to the centre of the wheel, and glue one side of the straw into place. So something like that. Then, after a quick test fit, I'll add some more glue to the other end of the straw, and making sure that the flat side of the wheel is sitting level on the desk, I'll stick that to the side of the house. And with any luck, that should result in this kind of thing. So, a nice little watermill, which we can then glue to one of the riverbanks, just like you can see here. So, there you go. There it is once it's been glued into place, and I think it should do the job nicely. Right then, the last thing we're going to make are a few more trees, and for these we'll take a few toothpicks, and you can also see that I've marked a line on each of them at a couple of different lengths. Then we'll need to cut out a piece of the trunk texture for each of these, and wrap that around the toothpick, using the line as a guide for how much of the point we want to be exposed. So, there you go, something like this. Then we can simply cut it to size, and as you can see here, we can make a whole bunch of these in different sizes, just by varying the length of the trunk and the size of the point. But for this example, I'll be using this one here. Okay, next we'll need to cut out the leaf pattern, and we're going to fold this in half, apply some glue to the inside, and then glue the paper together. Basically, we're making a double-sided texture. And once again, here's one that's had plenty of time to dry. Now, before going any further, it's best to tidy up any edges where the white paper is still showing, and then we can cut it roughly in half, maybe aiming to have one half slightly larger than the other. So, something like this. And I'll just quickly check to see if this is going to be big enough to cover the point of the toothpick, which it is. Okay, for this next part, we're going to use those decorative scissors again, but this time we're going to cut out tall triangular shapes, i.e. something that looks a bit like a pine tree. And we'll need 4 of those per tree. Now, we actually want these to be just a tiny bit longer than the exposed part of the toothpick, so if they're too long, we can simply trim them down to a more suitable size, like you can see me doing here. Next, we'll take each of these triangular pieces and bend them around another toothpick, so that they end up looking something like this. And I'll go ahead and quickly do the same thing to the other 3. So, there you go. Then, we can add some superglue to a bit of scrap card again, and using a toothpick, we can smear some glue along one edge of the exposed part of the tree trunk, and place one of the leaf patterns on top, which should result in this kind of thing. Then we can do the same thing again for the opposite side, which should end up looking something like this, and we can then repeat the process for the 2 gaps in between. And there you go, there's the finished tree. And if you have any places where the end of the toothpick is still showing through, like here for example, you can squash the edges of the leaf pattern together a bit, and that might help to disguise it. So yeah, there's an alternative tree design, which we can use instead of, or alongside, some of the existing trees. And these work best if you glue them to the hex tiles in little clusters of 3 or more. And I think that's everything just about covered, so here's an example of how these might look when used alongside some of the existing hex tiles, and if you're not familiar with the idea behind these, then feel free to check out the Tiny Terrain playlist, as that explains everything in a lot more detail. But yeah, that's it for this one, so thank you very much for watching. As always, I look forward to seeing what you think of these down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.